The snow began falling on a Tuesday afternoon, blanketing the small rural village of Millbrook in a thick layer of white that erased roads, fences, and any hope of leaving. By nightfall, the wind had picked up, howling across the open fields and piling drifts against the doors of every farmhouse and cottage. The village had no police station, no hospital, no telephone lines that could survive such weather. The nearest town was 40 miles away, and the mountain pass had been officially closed since noon. Victor Marsh, a 62-year-old man who had lived alone on his modest property since his wife passed away 5 years earlier, was last seen alive around 3 in the afternoon, when his neighbor Harold Vance spotted him carrying a bucket of feed toward the chicken coop. Harold waved from his own porch, but Victor did not wave back. He simply nodded and kept walking, his shoulders hunched against the wind. That was the last normal moment anyone could remember. Dorothy Blake, known to everyone as Dot, was the oldest resident in Millbrook, having turned 78 just a month ago. She lived in a small stone cottage at the bend of the dirt road, with a view of both Victor's farm and the crossroads that connected the village's 7 occupied homes. Dot had sharp eyes and a sharper memory. She had been a schoolteacher for 40 years before retiring, and she had never stopped paying attention to the small details that other people missed. That evening, as the snow piled higher and the temperature dropped, she sat by her window with a wool blanket over her knees, watching the dim lights flicker in her neighbors' windows. Around 7 o'clock, she noticed something odd. The light in Victor's barn was on. Not the house, not the coop, but the barn. The barn had no livestock anymore. Victor had sold his cattle 2 years ago. The barn was used for storing old tools, broken furniture, and the remains of a life that had slowly been dismantled piece by piece. So why was the light on, and why had it not turned off for over an hour? Dot made a mental note but decided not to act immediately. It was bitterly cold outside, and her legs ached from arthritis. The following morning, the storm had not relented. Snowdrifts reached the windowsills in some places, and the sky remained a dull, bruised gray. Dot wrapped herself in her heaviest coat and ventured outside to check on her own woodpile when she saw Harold Vance standing near the fence line between his property and Victor's. Harold was a man of few words, 55 years old, with a face that seemed carved from the same granite that lay beneath the village soil. He had lived next to Victor for 12 years, and their relationship had been cordial but distant. They shared tools when necessary and helped each other with heavy lifting, but they never visited each other's homes for coffee or conversation. This morning, however, Harold was staring intently at the barn door, which stood slightly ajar, snow creeping inside. He turned when he heard Dot's boots crunching through the snow and gave her a look that she had seen before, a look that said something was wrong. "Have you seen Victor this morning?" Harold asked, his breath forming clouds in the frozen air. Dot shook her head. She had not seen him since yesterday afternoon. Harold explained that he had knocked on Victor's front door 10 minutes ago and received no answer. He had walked around the house and seen that the back door was unlocked, which was unusual because Victor was meticulous about locking up at night. The barn light was still on, visible through the small window near the roof, and Harold had called out Victor's name several times without response. Dot felt a cold knot form in her stomach, a feeling that had nothing to do with the temperature. She suggested they look inside the barn together, partly because she did not want Harold to go alone and partly because she knew that 2 witnesses were better than 1. They pushed the barn door open wider, and the light from inside spilled out onto the snow, revealing a scene that would be etched into Dot's memory forever. Victor Marsh lay face down on the concrete floor near the back wall, his body sprawled at an unnatural angle, one arm twisted beneath him and the other stretched out as if reaching for something just beyond his grasp. A heavy wooden beam had fallen from a stack of lumber leaning against the wall, and it rested across Victor's lower back, pinning him to the ground. The beam was roughly 8 feet long and dense with age, and it looked as though it had been the cause of a terrible accident. Harold knelt beside Victor and pressed 2 fingers to his neck, then shook his head slowly. Victor was dead, his skin already cold to the touch and stiff with the onset of rigor mortis. The barn was freezing, the temperature inside barely above the outdoors, and that had preserved the body in a state that made it look almost peaceful except for the terrible angle of his neck. Harold straightened up and looked around the barn with a mixture of grief and confusion. The beam had been part of a pile of old construction materials that Victor had kept for years, stacked vertically against the wall and secured with a rope that now lay loose on the floor. It seemed plausible that Victor had disturbed the stack while searching for something, causing the beam to fall and crush him. But Dot was not convinced. She stood by the door for a long moment, her eyes moving methodically from the body to the beam to the rope and then back to the body. Something did not fit. Victor was a careful man, she thought to herself, he would not have been so clumsy. And why was the barn light on in the middle of the night? Victor had no reason to be in the barn after dark. More importantly, the position of the body bothered her. If the beam had fallen from a vertical stack, it would have struck Victor from above, likely hitting his head or shoulders first. But the beam lay across his lower back, and his head was oriented away from the stack, as if he had been facing the wall and then turned at the last second or been pushed. She kept these thoughts to herself for the moment. There was no point in alarming Harold without more evidence. They decided to inform the other neighbors, even though the storm made travel difficult. The village consisted of 7 homes clustered along a single dirt road that looped around a small frozen pond. Besides Victor, Harold, and the residents included Irene Cross, a sharp-tongued woman in her 60s who lived with 2 cats and a collection of antique china, Lester Finch, a retired mechanic whose hands were perpetually stained with grease despite having sold his garage 10 years ago, Mabel Shaw, a quiet widow in her 50s who kept to herself and rarely spoke more than a few words at a time, Oscar Pike, a young man of 22 who worked as a laborer on a nearby farm and lived alone in a converted shed, and Ruth Coleman, a retired nurse who had moved to Millbrook seeking peace after a long career in a chaotic city hospital. All of them were snowed in, and all of them would have to be told that one of their own had died under mysterious circumstances. By noon, the neighbors had gathered at Victor's house, which was the largest and warmest of the homes, with a fireplace that could accommodate all 8 of them. Ruth Coleman took charge of the situation in a practical, no-nonsense manner, confirming Victor's death with a brief examination and covering the body with a tarp that Harold found in the barn. Ruth agreed that the accident appeared straightforward but noted that without a proper medical examiner, they could not be certain of the exact cause of death. The storm showed no signs of stopping, and the nearest phone was useless because the lines were down. They were completely isolated, cut off from the outside world for what could be days. In the meantime, they would have to decide what to do with the body and whether to investigate further on their own. Dot sat in the corner of Victor's living room, wrapped in her wool blanket, watching the faces of her neighbors as they discussed the situation in hushed tones. Harold was pale and quiet, staring into the fire. Irene Cross was uncharacteristically silent, her lips pressed into a thin line. Lester Finch paced back and forth, rubbing his hands together as if trying to warm them, though the room was perfectly comfortable. Mabel Shaw sat apart from the others, her eyes fixed on a spot on the floor, her hands folded in her lap. Oscar Pike seemed agitated, shifting in his chair every few seconds and glancing toward the window as if expecting someone to arrive. Ruth Coleman was the most composed, organizing tasks and suggesting that someone should search Victor's house for any clues about what he might have been doing in the barn the night before. Dot waited until the conversation lulled, then spoke in a calm, measured voice. She said that she had been watching the village from her window for many years and that she had noticed something peculiar about the barn light. It had come on at 7 o'clock the previous evening and remained on all night, but Victor had been inside his house at 6:30, when she had seen him through his kitchen window. She asked if anyone had seen or heard anything unusual around that time. The room fell silent. Then Irene Cross spoke up, saying that she had heard a loud thump from the direction of Victor's property around 8 o'clock, but she had assumed it was a branch breaking under the weight of the snow. Lester Finch said he had heard nothing because his hearing was poor. Mabel Shaw said she had gone to bed early. Oscar Pike hesitated, then admitted he had been outside around 7:30, checking on his woodpile, and had seen a figure moving near Victor's barn. He could not identify the figure because of the darkness and the snow, but he thought it had been someone wearing a dark coat and a hat. A dark coat and a hat, Dot repeated slowly. She looked around the room and noticed that every single person there owned a dark coat and a hat. That detail alone proved nothing, but it planted a seed of suspicion in her mind. She then asked Ruth if she had examined the position of the beam relative to the body. Ruth said she had, and that it seemed consistent with a fall, though she admitted she was not an expert in forensic analysis. Dot pressed further, did the beam appear to have been deliberately placed on top of Victor after he was already on the ground? Ruth blinked, surprised by the question, and said she had not considered that possibility. Harold looked up sharply and asked Dot what she was implying. Dot replied that she was not implying anything, she was simply asking questions because the alternative was to accept a story that did not quite fit the facts, and she had never been very good at accepting easy answers. The afternoon wore on, and the snow continued to fall without mercy. The neighbors decided to move Victor's body into the cold cellar beneath his own house, where it would remain preserved until the storm passed and the authorities could arrive. Harold and Lester carried the tarp-wrapped body down the narrow stairs while the others waited upstairs in uncomfortable silence. When they returned, Lester's face was ashen, and he asked for a glass of water. Dot watched him carefully. She had known Lester for over a decade. He was a gruff but honest man, not given to nervousness or theatrical displays. Something had unsettled him, and she intended to find out what. Later, as the group dispersed to their own homes to check on their properties and fetch supplies for a communal dinner, Dot cornered Lester in the mudroom and asked him directly if he had seen anything strange while moving the body. Lester looked around to make sure no one else was listening, then lowered his voice and said that Victor's hands had bruises on the wrists, as if someone had grabbed him or restrained him before he died. The bruises were faint, and Lester might not have noticed them if he had not been holding Victor's arms to help carry the tarp. He had not mentioned it to the others because he was not sure it mattered, and he did not want to cause panic. Dot thanked him and said she would keep the information in mind. By evening, the group had reconvened at Victor's house, which had become the de facto gathering place. Everyone brought food, a pot of stew from Irene, bread from Mabel, dried meat from Oscar, and a thermos of coffee from Ruth. Harold contributed a bottle of whiskey, which he placed on the table without comment. The mood was somber, and the conversation drifted from memories of Victor to speculation about how long the storm might last to the practical question of where they would store firewood if the cold intensified. Dot listened more than she spoke, filing away every word, every glance, every hesitation. She noticed that Oscar avoided eye contact with Harold, that Irene kept looking at Mabel with an expression that bordered on suspicion, and that Ruth was the only person who seemed completely at ease, moving around the kitchen and serving food as if she were hosting a dinner party rather than mourning a neighbor's death. After the meal, Dot announced that she wanted to revisit the barn before it got completely dark. She asked Harold to accompany her, and he agreed reluctantly. The two of them put on their coats and boots and trudged through the knee-deep snow to the barn, where the door was still slightly ajar and the light still burned overhead. Inside, the scene remained largely unchanged except for the absence of the body. Dot walked slowly around the space, examining the floor, the walls, the stack of lumber from which the beam had supposedly fallen. She asked Harold to hold a lantern close to the floor, and she knelt down despite her aching knees to inspect the concrete surface. Near where Victor's head had rested, she saw a small smear of something dark that might have been blood, but more importantly, she saw scuff marks that did not match the pattern of a fall. The marks were parallel and close together, as if shoes had been dragged across the floor rather than stepped. She pointed this out to Harold, who knelt beside her and studied the marks for a long moment. He agreed that they looked strange, but he offered a possible explanation. Maybe Victor had been injured and then tried to crawl toward the door. Dot considered this but noted that the marks were oriented away from the door, not toward it, as if someone had been pulling Victor deeper into the barn. They searched the rest of the barn methodically, finding little else of interest except a kitchen knife hidden beneath a pile of old rags near the back corner. The knife was clean, with no visible blood or residue, but its presence was odd because Victor had no reason to keep a kitchen knife in the barn. Harold suggested that perhaps Victor had brought it with him for some purpose, maybe to cut rope or open a package. Dot said nothing, but she wrapped the knife in a cloth and put it in her coat pocket, intending to show it to Ruth later. As they left the barn, Dot paused and looked up at the light fixture hanging from the ceiling. It was a simple bulb with a pull chain, and it was still illuminated. She asked Harold if he knew whether Victor usually left the barn light on at night. Harold said he did not, but he remembered that Victor had once complained about a raccoon getting into the barn and had said he would leave the light on to scare it away. That was months ago, and the raccoon problem had apparently resolved itself. Dot filed this information away as well. That night, after everyone had gone home or retired to the guest rooms in Victor's house, Dot sat alone in the living room with a notepad and a pencil. She wrote down everything she had observed, from the position of the body to the bruises on the wrists to the scuff marks on the floor to the hidden knife. She also wrote down the alibis that each neighbor had offered, as incomplete as they were. Harold claimed he had been home all evening, reading by the fire. Irene said she had been listening to the radio. Lester said he had gone to bed early. Mabel said she had been knitting. Oscar said he had been outside checking on his woodpile, which gave him the opportunity to see the mysterious figure. Ruth said she had been preparing dinner and then reading a book. None of these alibis could be verified, and none of them excluded anyone from having been at Victor's barn around 8 o'clock, when Irene had heard the thump. The more Dot thought about it, the more she became convinced that Victor's death was not an accident. The question was not whether a crime had been committed, but who had committed it and why. The following morning, the storm showed the first signs of weakening. The snowfall became lighter, and the wind died down to a gentle breeze. The villagers emerged from their homes with renewed hope that they might soon be able to travel. But Dot knew that the weather was only part of the problem. The real issue was that a killer might still be among them, and if the storm cleared before the truth came out, that person could simply walk away and never be held accountable. She gathered everyone at Victor's house once more and announced that she had found evidence suggesting foul play. She showed them the knife and the scuff marks and the bruises, and she explained why the accident theory did not hold up. The room reacted with a mixture of shock and disbelief. Irene Cross was the first to object, demanding to know who would want to kill Victor, a harmless old man who had never hurt anyone. Lester Finch shook his head and said it could not be true, that they all knew each other too well for something like this to happen. Mabel Shaw stared at Dot with wide eyes but said nothing. Oscar Pike looked as though he might be sick. Ruth Coleman asked Dot if she had any idea who the killer might be. Dot took a deep breath and said that she did not know yet, but she had a theory. She explained that the killer must have been someone who knew Victor's routine, someone who had access to his property without raising suspicion, and someone who had a reason to want him dead. The killer had most likely lured Victor to the barn under a false pretext, struck him or pushed him to the ground, and then deliberately placed the beam on top of him to make the death look like an accident. The bruises on Victor's wrists suggested that he had been grabbed or restrained, possibly while trying to get up. The scuff marks indicated that he had been dragged a short distance. The hidden knife might have been intended as a weapon but was never used, perhaps because the killer found a simpler method. All of this pointed to someone who was not a professional criminal but an ordinary person who had snapped under pressure or acted out of desperation. The room fell silent again. Then Harold spoke up, his voice low and serious. He said that if Dot was right, then the killer was standing in that room with them at that very moment. He looked around at the faces of his neighbors, each one familiar and yet suddenly strange. He asked if anyone had anything to confess, any secret that might explain why Victor had to die. No one spoke. The silence stretched on for an uncomfortable minute, broken only by the crackling of the fire. Finally, Oscar Pike stood up abruptly and announced that he was leaving. He said he did not have to listen to these accusations, and he walked toward the door. Harold blocked his path and told him to sit down. Oscar protested, but Harold's steady gaze and larger frame convinced him to return to his chair. The tension in the room was palpable, thick enough to be cut with a knife. Dot decided to change tactics. She began asking questions about Victor's past, about any conflicts or resentments that might have festered beneath the surface. She reminded everyone that Victor had lived in Millbrook for over 30 years, and in that time, he had interacted with every person in the room in ways both large and small. Had anyone had a disagreement with Victor recently? Had anyone owed him money? Had anyone been involved in a dispute over property lines, tools, or any other matter? Irene Cross mentioned that Victor had accused her cat of killing his chickens last summer, and they had exchanged harsh words, but that seemed like a trivial motive for murder. Lester Finch recalled that Victor had refused to lend him a tractor part 2 winters ago, causing Lester to miss a repair job, but again, that was hardly a reason to kill someone. Mabel Shaw said nothing at all, and Ruth Coleman simply shook her head. Oscar Pike hesitated, then said that Victor had threatened to report him to the authorities for poaching deer on his land. That had happened just 3 weeks ago, and Oscar had been furious about it, but he insisted he had gotten over it. Dot listened carefully to each answer, but none of them felt like the truth she was searching for. She had the sense that someone in the room was hiding something much larger than a petty dispute over chickens or tractor parts. She decided to examine the house itself while the others waited, hoping to find a clue that Victor might have left behind. Ruth offered to accompany her, and the 2 women searched Victor's study, bedroom, and kitchen methodically. In the study, they found a locked drawer in Victor's desk. Dot asked if anyone had a key, but no one did. Harold volunteered to break the lock, and after a few moments of effort, the drawer popped open. Inside, they found a stack of letters tied with a ribbon, a small notebook with handwritten entries, and a photograph of a young woman that none of them recognized. Dot began reading the letters, which were addressed to Victor and signed with the initial M. They were love letters, passionate and desperate, written 20 years ago. The woman, whoever she was, had been involved with Victor while he was still married to his late wife. The letters spoke of secret meetings, broken promises, and a child that might or might not exist. Dot looked up from the letters and saw that Mabel Shaw had gone pale. Mabel was the only person in the room whose first name started with M. Dot asked her directly if she was the M who had written the letters. Mabel shook her head, but her hands were trembling, and she could not meet Dot's eyes. Irene Cross leaned forward and said that Mabel had moved to Millbrook 18 years ago, 2 years after the last letter was written. That was a coincidence, but Dot did not believe in coincidences, not when a man was dead and a killer was loose. She asked Mabel again, more gently this time, to explain her connection to Victor. Mabel sat in silence for a long moment, tears forming in her eyes, and then she spoke in a voice so quiet that everyone had to lean in to hear her. She admitted that she was the M who had written the letters, that she had been Victor's lover 20 years ago, and that she had come to Millbrook hoping to rekindle their relationship after his wife died. But Victor had rejected her, saying he wanted to forget the past and live in peace. Mabel had stayed in the village anyway, unable to leave, watching from a distance as Victor grew older alone. But Dot knew that a rejected lover, while sad, did not necessarily make a killer. She pressed Mabel further, asking about the child mentioned in the letters. Mabel broke down completely then, sobbing into her hands. She confessed that she had given birth to Victor's child, a daughter, and that the daughter had died of an illness when she was only 3 years old because Victor had refused to provide financial support for her medical treatment. Mabel had never forgiven him. She had spent 18 years harboring that grudge, and the pain had only grown sharper with time. On the night of the storm, she had gone to Victor's barn to confront him one last time, to make him understand what he had taken from her. They had argued, and Victor had pushed her away, and she had grabbed him by the wrists to keep him from leaving. In the struggle, he had tripped and fallen, hitting his head on the concrete floor. He was dazed but still alive. Mabel had panicked. She saw the stack of lumber nearby and, in a moment of blind rage and despair, she had pulled a beam free and placed it across his back to make it look like an accident. Then she had fled back to her house, hoping that the storm would cover her tracks and that no one would ever know the truth. The room erupted in gasps and murmurs. Harold stood up and stared at Mabel as if seeing her for the first time. Irene Cross covered her mouth with both hands. Lester Finch shook his head slowly, muttering that he could not believe it. Oscar Pike looked relieved, as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. Ruth Coleman sat perfectly still, her face unreadable. Dot felt a profound sadness settle over her. She had suspected many people, but she had not wanted it to be Mabel, the quiet widow who had never harmed anyone, or so everyone thought. The truth was that pain and grief could transform anyone, and Victor's refusal to help his own child had set in motion a chain of events that ended with his death 20 years later. Mabel asked if anyone would call the police, but of course there was no phone, and the storm had not yet cleared. They would have to wait, and in the meantime, they would have to keep Mabel somewhere safe where she could not harm herself or anyone else. Harold volunteered to stay with Mabel in her house, watching over her until the authorities could arrive. Mabel offered no resistance. She seemed almost relieved to have confessed, as if the weight of 18 years had finally been lifted. The others dispersed to their homes, each lost in their own thoughts. Dot remained in Victor's living room, staring into the dying fire. She had solved the puzzle, but there was no satisfaction in it, only the hollow recognition that ordinary people were capable of terrible things when pushed past their breaking point. She thought about the daughter who had died, a child she had never known existed, a life that might have been saved if Victor had been a better man. She thought about Mabel, sitting alone in her house with Harold, waiting for a future that would almost certainly involve prison. And she thought about herself, an old woman with sharp eyes and a sharper memory, wondering if she had done the right thing by uncovering the truth. The storm finally stopped the next morning. The sun rose over a world transformed, every surface glittering with fresh snow, the silence so complete that Dot could hear her own heartbeat. Harold walked to the edge of the village and found that the road was still impassable, but a snowplow had been spotted in the distance, crawling toward them at a glacial pace. By midday, the plow had cleared a path, and 2 state troopers arrived in a 4-wheel drive vehicle. Dot and Harold explained what had happened, and the troopers took Mabel into custody without incident. She went quietly, her head bowed, her hands clasped in front of her. As the vehicle drove away, Irene Cross let out a long breath and said she needed a drink. Lester Finch offered to join her. Oscar Pike walked back to his shed without a word. Ruth Coleman stood on Victor's porch, watching the taillights disappear around the bend, and then she turned to Dot and asked if she would like some tea. Dot accepted, and the two women walked together to Dot's cottage, where the fire was already burning low. That evening, Dot sat in her usual chair by the window, looking out at the village that had been her home for 40 years. The lights were on in every house, warm and steady against the gathering darkness. She thought about the fragility of human relationships, how easily love could turn to hate, how secrets buried for decades could rise up to destroy everything. She also thought about the importance of paying attention, of noticing the small details that most people overlooked, because those details were often the difference between a mystery solved and a murderer walking free. She picked up her notepad and looked at the list she had made, the observations that had led her to the truth, the light in the barn that should not have been on, the position of the body that did not match a fall, the bruises on the wrists, the scuff marks on the floor, the hidden knife, the letters in the drawer. Each piece had been a thread, and she had pulled them one by one until the whole tapestry unraveled. The next day, the village began to return to normal. The snowplows cleared the remaining roads, and a hearse came to collect Victor's body. The state troopers returned to take formal statements from everyone, and Dot spent an hour answering questions about everything she had seen and heard. The troopers thanked her for her thoroughness and told her that her observations would be crucial to the prosecution's case. Mabel would be charged with manslaughter, possibly murder, depending on the findings of the autopsy. Dot did not celebrate, she simply felt tired, a deep and bone-weary exhaustion that had nothing to do with her age. She had spent her life teaching children to think critically, to question assumptions, to look for evidence before drawing conclusions. She had never imagined that she would have to apply those lessons to the death of a neighbor, but life had a way of surprising people, even old women who thought they had seen everything. Weeks later, after the snow had melted and the first flowers of spring had begun to appear, Dot received a letter from Mabel, written from the county jail. The letter was short and apologetic. Mabel said that she was sorry for the pain she had caused, that she had never intended to kill anyone, that she had simply lost control after years of silent suffering. She asked Dot to visit her sometime, to talk about old memories, to help her understand how everything had gone so wrong. Dot read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and placed it in the same drawer where Victor had kept his secrets. She did not know if she would visit Mabel. Part of her wanted to offer forgiveness or at least understanding. Another part of her wanted to leave the past where it belonged, buried under the snow of a long winter, never to be disturbed again. In the end, she decided to wait and see what the spring brought. There was no rush, after all. Time was the one thing she had plenty of, and time had a way of revealing the truth, just as it always had. The village of Millbrook returned to its quiet rhythms, the neighbors nodded to each other on the road, and the barn stood empty and dark. But Dot Blake never stopped watching from her window, because she knew that secrets had a way of hiding in plain sight, and that the smallest detail could change everything.